What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists. At a time when most people didn't believe that, he collected those evidences. And that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment, what I saw these young African Americans doing, was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening. We'll do that again. Good evening. Well, welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. My name is Novella Ford, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions. And thank you for joining us for this evening's Black Writers at Work, the first of two pre-literary festival events taking place this week. Our next one is on Wednesday, June 14th, with jazz musician, composer, and multi-instrumentalist Henry Threadgill, who will be in conversation with the poet Yusef Komunyakaa, discussing Threadgill's latest publication, an autobiography, Easily Slipped into Another World, A Life in Music, co-written by Columbia University professor and my colleague here at the Schomburg Center, Brent Hayes Edwards, who will moderate the conversation. We are excited to reconvene our community of book lovers to interact with their favorite authors on 135th Street in Harlem, New York this Saturday as part of what is probably a myriad of Juneteenth events taking place in New York City. I'd like to say that this is our 5th annual literary festival happening on June 17th, so give it up for number 5. We like to call this our intergenerational literary block party, celebrating the joy-filled privilege as well as necessity of reading, while also celebrating the legacy of Arturo Schomburg and librarian and the first director of the Schomburg Center, Jean Blackwell Hudson. The festival opens with a very lovely procession that starts outside on 135th Street. We usually have dancers, there will be choirs, there will be song, and then following that we have our keynote conversation, which exemplifies our theme, Literacy is Generational Wealth. The conversation will feature Sarah Ladipo Menyinka, whose latest book is Between Starshine and Clay, Conversations from the African Diaspora. We are honoring the passing down of books, positive ideas about reading, and continuing to be bold in our choices at a time when the currents are pushing against the freedom to read and the invaluable service of public libraries. This festival is a celebration of readers and writers across genres and generations, and I hope you plan to join us on Wednesday as well as on Saturday. Which brings me, though, to tonight's conversation. It jumps off from this book called Black Women Writers at Work, written by scholar Claudia Tate, and it was published in 1983, I want to say, and I want to read a little from her introduction. She writes, Black Women Writers at Work is not a collection of disrobing expose revealing the personal lives of Black women writers. Neither is it purely literary in its focus that the writer's experiences and interests are divorced from their works. Extra-literary concerns, social and political issues, as well as intimate aspects of their personal lives, do indeed have direct bearing on the creative process. This viewpoint is by no means new and startling. As long as critics have been around, they have insisted that the artist's life and art are inextricably linked. This rather predictable relationship, however, takes on especially vibrant technical and thematic forms when an artist is creating within an environment of diverse and often conflicting social traditions. This book builds its literary foundation on this notion of linkage. And that's what we are doing this evening. We're trying to connect the past and the present, thinking about how Black writers today engage in their writing practices, while also talking about some of our participants' favorite literary figures and how they wrote in their day and or how they write today, because of course writers also gain from each other and their peers in real time, but also those who have come before them. So joining us for this conversation is Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She is the author of In Search of a Beautiful Freedom, New and Selected Essays, as well as that came out about 2 years ago, Read Until You Understand, among other works. She is a recipient of the 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship, and she lives here in New York. Please welcome Farah Jasmine Griffin to the stage. Candice Iloh is a first-generation Nigerian-American writer whose books sent her home. They are from the Midwest by way of Washington, D.C. and Brooklyn, New York. They are a proud alumna of the Rhode Island Writers Colony, and their work has earned fellowships from Lando Literary, Vona, and Cambilio Fiction, and a residency with High Arts, where they debuted their first one-person show in 2018. Candice became a 2020 National Book Award finalist, and in 2021, a Prince Award honoree for their debut novel, Everybody Looking. Salt the Water is their third novel coming out soon. Please welcome Candice Iloh. Also joining us is Ibi Zoboi, who is the author of numerous titles, including American Street, which was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award in Young Adults Literature, a Time Magazine Best YA Book of All Time, and a Kirkus Best Book of the Year. Also Pride, a contemporary remix of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and My Life as an Ice Cream Sandwich, a moving middle grade debut of a girl finding her place in a world that's changing at warp speed. Zoboi is also the co-author of the Walter Award and LA Times Book Prize-winning Punching the Air with prison reform activist Dr. Yusef Salaam, who is also running for council member of this district here in Harlem. Her more recent titles include Okoye, To the People, a Black Panther novel for Marvel, as well as Star Child, which came out this year, an illumination of the young life of the visionary storyteller Octavia E. Butler in poems and prose, and the novel Nigeria Jones, also out this year. Please welcome Ibi Zoboi. And last but not least, we tried to find the swaggiest moderator we could, and that's a hat tip to the Literary Swag Book Club, founded by Yahdon Israel, who's the senior editor at Simon Schuster. Yahdon has a passion for promoting literacy and connecting readers with books. He brings an entrepreneurial spirit to these pursuits as the founder of the Popular Book Club, host of a literary podcast, creative writing teacher, event producer, magazine editor, and writer, as well as his work in support of several prestigious literary awards. With that said, I will turn it over to Yahdon Israel to take us through this incredible conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Come on, Swaggy.
You ain't have the key.
Yeah.
How y'all doing? Good evening, everybody. All right, one more time. Good evening, everybody. All right, how y'all doing?
Good.
I like how you always have to like come out and act like you ain't. I ain't seen none of y'all just like less than 3 minutes ago. So this conversation is about Black writers at work, and the way that I want us to participate in the conversation, things for y'all to consider yourselves, is something that is about the distinction between like jobs and work, and thinking about the language. So like one of the things that's important is about like the difficulty of being a creative, a writer, an artist, is that many people in our lives, if we're not from backgrounds or families that have artists or creatives in it, they do not recognize our labor as work. Namely because it doesn't make money, it doesn't necessarily pay bills, it's not like quantified in the way an hourly worker is, like you get paid X amount for doing this, and you don't have a 401k, you don't have any of those things. So one of the things that's important for myself in moderating this discussion is like challenging what we qualify and what we think of as work, and then how we go about reifying our definitions and the labors that each of you do as writers and thinkers. So the first question for anybody who wants to, we can go down and we can go across, is how would you define your work? Like, how would you define work? Umbrella definition.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll start simply because I wrote a biography of Octavia Butler. And in it, I wrote 2 poems about work, 2 types of work, the work that her mother did and the work that she did. Mm-hmm. Her mother was a domestic worker, meaning, she was a maid. She cleaned white people's homes, as many women did at that time. And in an interview, Octavia Butler always said that her mother wanted her to do sit-down work as opposed to cleaning people's homes. And that sit-down work in her mother's vision for her was secretarial work. Yeah. So at 13, Octavia Butler was given a typewriter And she was 13, and that was 1960. So the dream was not necessarily to be a novelist, but to be able to sit down and be able to type and not have to stand on her feet, not have to be on her hands and knees cleaning floors.
Yeah.
So I also think about the work that my mother does as a registered nurse, and I don't think I ever saw my mother lounging or resting. And my mother's like lounge space is a dining room table and maybe one chair. So her lounge, we didn't have a sofa in the way that I have a sofa in my home. So to the point now, she turned 70 years old and she had 2 knee replacement surgeries. So she was always on her feet. Meanwhile, I spent hours sitting down to my own detriment, right? So my work is creative. It is the life of the mind. It is hard work because it doesn't take a toll on the body in the same way that our parents, worked, but it takes a toll on the mind. Yeah. So I would describe the work that I do, the life of the mind. And I don't think it's always healthy.
Okay.
Wow. Is this one? Okay, all right.
You gotta talk to your shirt.
Blue.
I think when I think about work, I think about living, honestly. I feel like I didn't start actually knowing how to write until I started understanding myself. In order for me to understand myself, I had to have a life. Like I had to actually interact and engage with the world and process things and take all of these like lessons and skills and build upon them somehow to create some type of fruit or some type of product or something that creates some type of shift in the world. But I see my work as living. I feel like one of the reasons why I became a writer was because as a child, there was just so many things I wasn't allowed to talk about. There weren't a lot of things I was allowed to say out loud. There were a lot of things that just were kind of just off the table for me. And so in order for me or I guess like my growth process as a human being became learning what I like, what I don't like, what works for me as far as rest and not rest, what works for me as far as like having energy to engage with the world or not. Am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? What are my problems? What is my trauma? What is my my thing that I'm constantly trying to peel back and figure out about myself throughout life? And the more that I learn about myself and how I engage with the world and how I see the world, there is more that I have to say on the page. And I think that like learning ourselves is probably the hardest work that there is. Whereas like day jobs, depending on what kind of day job you do, I see it more as tasking. There's less processing time, whereas as a writer, it is all about the process. It is all about the living. And I have less to say when I don't go out and engage with the world.
Wow. What you both have said just really has me thinking. I mean, I think also about my mother. My mother was her day job was as a factory seamstress. She worked in a factory, sewing, doing piecework. But she also sewed, for people outside of her day job. She sewed for family members, she sewed for neighbors. She sewed to make extra money, but she got great joy and pleasure and creativity in that sewing. And I think seeing those two different ways of approaching a job and work also helped shape my sense of having a job and having work in a way. And I'm lucky, I have a job that I like. I'm a college professor. I like teaching. I don't like committee work.
Break that down for people who don't know what that works.
There are tons of committees that you have to be on to help run a university. I'm talented as an administrator. I don't like that work, but I can do it. That's part of my job. It pays the bills.
Yeah.
I have a job that pays the bills. It's not onerous. It's not my mother working in a factory with exploitive labor conditions. Like every day, I'm clear that's not the same thing, but it's my job. It's a job that also allows me to do the thing that I love, but which is also hard, and that's the work to me, which is the writing. And that is sometimes the hardest thing that you'll do, but it's, you know, it's conceptual, it's creative, sometimes it doesn't come. Sometimes it makes me face everything that I don't know. But I think that's the distinction for me, is the job versus the work.
Thank you. I like my definite, like something I talk to my friends about when we have like these philosophical conversations. Like the way I've described it is like the job is the stuff that you can quantify. Like you know how much you're getting paid, you know when you're getting paid, you know what it pays for. You can quantify and you can measure it. And I consider the work as those things that don't come with a quick measurement. So like spending 2 hours reading a book, you don't necessarily know how that's going to benefit you later. Or watching Martin for 6 hours and calling it research. It's like, well, what does that research actually amount to? So like I've thought of work of like those things that are more about legacy, things that like you're going to reap the benefits for it in a time you least expect it, in a way you don't know how, that you can't necessarily quantify and sell to somebody and going, my creativity means this for someone else, which comes to my like next question that I'm curious about is like thinking about that so much of the life of the mind, the things that you create are done in private, right? That there isn't necessarily a public that can immediately assign a certain value to it that justifies the labor. How do you decide what is worth the time put into it to make work? So all the books you've done, each of you, how did you decide, and you could pick any project, or like how do you decide this is something you're going to decide to work on? Like something that just entertains, like, okay, that was a passing thought, versus like, I'm going to do a book. I'm going to do 80,000 words on this one subject.
Still haven't done that.
Huh?
I still haven't done 80,000 words. I don't think I ever will.
I have.
So the question is what determines?
Like, how do you decide what you about to like commit like knowing that it necessarily doesn't turn into like money immediately. It's not going to necessarily pay your bills, right? Like you take a job somewhere, again, you know when you're getting paid, you know how things are coming in, but then it's like, oh, I'm gonna write this essay. What justifies the time, like more importantly than the money, time you don't get back, time you can't prove, like what justifies for you? How do you know when you have something that's worth working on?
Conviction.
Okay.
I feel like feeling is everything for me personally. I feel like I came into the publishing industry with like certain things that I had to say. I didn't know what books they would become or what the stories would be, but I knew what space I wanted to speak from, and I really am guided by what I feel strongly about and what scenes are already coming on their own. So I don't always like write, I don't write from the beginning. I write the scene that's already in my head. I can see the bed, I can see the chair, I can see the face, I can feel the air, all of those kind of things. And I think that if my mind is already working on its own and already has those kind of visuals in it, and I feel strongly about the story, that's really enough for me.
Okay.
For me, it's always context. We write for young adults. I'm writing I've written for children 9 books now, and context for me is what's not out there, what's missing. And I write, and we were just talking about this, I write from the tradition of Black women writers, Black writers, and in the adult, not adult XXX, but in the grown-up world. And I always have to have that caveat because I write for children. But there's so many stories that have not been told in the children's space. And there's always room for our niche stories to be told. So I always start with, what do I know that is true about people of African descent in the world? What do I know is true about Black people in New York City? What do I know is true about myself that I have not seen in the media? And I try to fill that space from my own perspective, from my own lived experience. And I then become passionate about it because no one else did this. You know, this is something new. This is something fresh. And we know in the marketplace, innovation is usually celebrated at the same time. Innovation from the Black experience is also not deemed as valuable because there's also the white gaze. So me thinking about what to work on is also thinking about what will sell. And thinking about what will sell is also thinking about the white gaze. And in that moment, making a decision about, you know what, this is a truth about us that needs to be told. And I demand a certain, to be paid a certain amount because it hasn't been told. So to be, to hell with the white gaze, and we'll deal with that later. So this is where I am now. If you asked me 2 years ago, I wouldn't have said that answer, but now it is part needing to be compensated for my time and needing to be compensated for innovation and worrying about the rest later.
I've written things that, I've written so much that will never see the light of day. And I've written things thinking I knew what I was writing for, and gotten partly through it and realized I'm not writing about this, or this is not going to be a book, or maybe this might be an essay, or maybe this will find its way in something else. I mean, not everything I write ends up finding its way to a reader.
Yeah.
Most of it does not.
Right.
But it's worth it. Like, I learn something, I make my way to figuring out what it is I'm trying to say.
Right.
Like, the way I process the world, the way I process grief, the way I process everything since I was a child is I have to write it first. And then I figure out whether or not other people might be interested in hearing it, or it might be of value to them. Yeah.
All right. Something you all have said, and using, because the word work is like a noun, but it's also a verb, right? Like, if something works, how do you know something works? A question, something you bring up that I think about a lot, and it was an interview. I have a lot of sports references. If you can't tell by my hat and my shoes. But there was an interview with, what's the brother's name, from the Bucks, Giannis, and he got eliminated from the playoffs, and they asked him if he feel like he did a bad job or something like that, or if he feel like a failure, and he was like, this is a terrible way to talk about it. He goes, Michael Jordan played 17 seasons, he won 6 rings, which means he lost 13 seasons. Do we look at him as a failure? Right, like a Hall of Fame career in Major League Baseball is 300, which means you're striking out. If you go to the plate 10 times, you're striking out 7. But that's a Hall of Fame career. And I think that something I'm considering when I talk about labor and I talk about creativity with Black and brown creatives, and just creatives at large, the way in which we internalize failure is something that keeps us from arriving at the kinds of successes we want, because we look at every project as having to have gone out into the world and working. And there are so many things that, Jordan retires in '89, he is not the greatest basketball player, or he's not considered one of the greats. But 17, that whole 90s season, and it's I think about oftentimes, what about those people who, because it's not their time yet, they're still in that phase of figuring out what works, that the way that they think about their work is unvaluable because nothing has worked yet. I'm curious for y'all, as you navigate drafts, as you navigate ideas that you shelf, and you're working in real time, you still have bills, you still have all these things. What language do you have to speak to yourself with to contextualize what would be considered as the failures? The things that quote unquote don't work? How do you think about those things?
Wow, that's a great question.
Thank you. I studied for this one. I can't.
Bravo to that.
That is such a good question. Yeah.
Oh man, I'll jump right into it because I think we're all in this, but I feel like that question really resonated with me, because in writing from a certain perspective, which is the Black experience, and we know, we've heard we're not a monolith, and not every aspect of our lived experiences has made it onto a big screen or into the pages of a book. I always have to remember where I am. It's like reading the room. I feel like I write these things from very personal lived experience, and when it leaves my imagination, when that, it goes onto the computer screen, and when that draft is sent to my editor, something happens. And I think we don't talk a lot about when it moves from that very personal, visceral space, that creative space, and it goes into the hands of someone who doesn't really know your lived experience or our collective lived experiences. That could be a step towards failure if I look at it as, wow, they're not going to understand what I'm saying. And then the failure comes, like all the steps after that, when it goes to reviewers and it goes out into the public. And for me, and I wonder if that's the case for you, writing about highly intelligent, the deep emotional lives of Black girls or Black non-binary children, if there is an element of, well, where's me in the story when it comes to a white writer and white reader? White readers are usually the reviewers, they're the teachers, they're the librarians who are judging our work. And I'm seeing that 9 books in, and I've been writing for my entire adult life, where our visceral stories are put under a microscope. And if we listen to that feedback, we will see it as a failure. So I have to renegotiate success and failures with every project. And I always have to remember the pervasiveness of the white gaze. And Toni Morrison has that book, what is it? Whiteness in Playing in the Dark.
Whiteness in the Literary Imagination.
Whiteness in the Literary Imagination. And I'm also thinking about Blackness in the white reader's imagination, and especially when it comes to Black children.
Okay.
I don't know. I feel like I don't really entertain the idea of failure a lot. I feel like I came into the writing industry super hungry in a way where I just decided that what I was writing was going to get published. I didn't really think about all the stuff that happens after you write it. But in general, I think that I am a success when I get a certain kind of feedback from Black children. I haven't felt that feeling of failure necessarily because I try to ignore it, but I feel like this idea of universality and like making something super broad that everybody can read it, that would make me actually feel like a failure. I feel like leaning into the nuance and the more specific stories of Black children makes me already feel like I'm doing something all on its own. I feel more like a failure, and I feel like I'm failing when I really start to listen to those business terms like marketing, and I just really cannot. Like, something happens to the work when you start thinking about the sales. Like, I have to not think about how well it will do or what is doing well until I'm like done with it and it's out of my hands. But yeah, I think I would feel like a failure if Black kids didn't get what I was doing. That's what would feel like failure for me personally.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think.
Do you think it's great? No, Mom.
Oh no,
I was teasing.
No, I think it's great. I think it's great that the Black kids being the judge, right? The people for whom you're writing. I think that so much of my early, I considered myself a writer before I became an academic. But I began publishing as an academic. And publishing as an academic means you go through a process of what they call a referee process, where you are submitting things and you have anonymous people reading it and judging it and telling you basically you're stupid, or what you need to, it's a constant set of rejection or acceptance that is contingent upon your meeting a certain set of standards that you don't define. And I have gotten so used to that I think, I sort of have separated my work from that, that's a part of a process, so that I don't even, there's a way that those things that are external to my work, I could read them as failure, but I don't accept that as failure.
Right.
That's just part of the process. And so that if my agent goes out with a project and the editors don't like it, I don't take that as a failure. Right. I just take it as it's not what the market is interested in, right? So that's not a failure. Yeah. The sense of a failure is what doesn't work for me. It doesn't come together in the way that I think it comes together. It doesn't make sense in the way that I think it makes sense. Or sometimes it comes together perfectly in my mind, but then I give it to somebody to read who I respect, and they say, this doesn't make any sense. And then I know that I have failed. I've utterly failed. But I think it's taken me a long time to get to those distinctions.
No, and something when you said about the language about between marketing and then like editors. Yeah. So, all told, I'm a senior editor at Simon Schuster, right? So for people who don't know, like the role I play is what's considered a gatekeeper. And ironically, I've been in this industry 2 years. I've learned that like we don't actually, I would not consider the role gatekeeping. I would say it's standing in front of a door that no one knows is open. And what I mean by that is what most people don't understand about the business. Candice, I hope your brain don't shut down for this. I'm gonna give you some business stuff. Don't stay with me. Is that like publishing is a business to business model, right? What does that mean? So how many people here are creators? Raise your hand. How many people here have been in like MFA programs or like programs in which most of the people you're interfacing with about your art are other artists or teachers? Okay. So what I mean by that is like in publishing, we sell to booksellers who sell to book buyers, people who actually buy books. If you went to Simon & Schuster, for example, like how many of you have gone to simonandschuster.com and bought a book directly from the website? If anyone raised their hand, they would be lying. Because when you go to Simon & Schuster and you try to buy any book, that site redirects you to 8 other places. It redirects you to Barnes & Nobles, it redirects you to Amazon, it redirects you to all these places. The point of that is that we, as a framework, we don't even know who are buying books and what resonates with them. So Amazon has that data. They know who's buying books. They know when they're buying books. They know how many books they're buying. Apple has that information. Your local bookstore has that information. So as a person who works in publishing, something I'm like really aware of is like how so much of the chain of like getting things into the market is taken as a proxy of the market. So my literary taste as an editor doesn't reflect at all what a market actually wants, because I don't even know what the market wants. Publishers put books out all the time that doesn't resonate, and everyone's shrugging their shoulders because we don't interface directly. I say this to say that like one of the difficulties of navigating the work is like what happens when you confuse your peer group for your audience. Right? Like when you're trying to impress the people at your workshop table, or you conflate what you said, right? Like other writers who ironically aren't going to buy your book, aren't the intended audience, but when you go through this process of art making, your agent starts to stand in for your idea of your audience, then the editors start to stand in for your idea of an audience, then the publicity and the marketing and sales teams and none of them are actually the audience. And so one of the questions I have for you all is like, navigating creatively, right? And you're creating in a vacuum to an extent. And like writing is one of the unique things that's like stand up in an empty room where you tell a joke and no one's there. So you won't know for a very long time if you're funny or not, because you're working on your book alone for a while and it takes like 2 years from the time you get it published to get actual, not even reviews, right? Because reviews are not necessarily, it's not like 13-year-olds are reviewing your books and going, I love this book. Like you got an adult saying, I didn't think this book was good for kids, as opposed to like an actual child coming to you. So how do y'all fortify yourselves for that long tail to actually be present for the actual person for whom you created the thing for? Like, how do you keep that person in mind? Because like you said, there's so many people who stand in the way at every stage of that person. And I know that can be discouraging. Like you, by the time a kid goes, hey, I love your book, get out of my face, kid. Because you kind of like just demoralized by that point. How do y'all fortify? How do y'all keep yourself fortified?
Well, I was an educator for 10 plus years, and for everybody looking, as I was writing, I would kind of put it in front of my kids with my name not on it.
Okay.
So their feedback, without them knowing it, was keeping me kind of like in line. Like, they didn't know it was my book, and they would run up to my desk and they would be like, I know what this feels like. Like, what is this? Like, this is your book, isn't it? And I wouldn't answer. Like, no, I just really, because from the beginning, I just really didn't want to get caught up in
Wait, so I'm sorry.
that.
Logistically, how would you do this? Like, would it be an assignment? Like, you gonna read something?
Oh, so any student that would like end their work early, I gave them something to read.
Oh, it's like,
Yeah, so I had tons of like extra books.
I got
in
something
the
for
class.
you.
Like I had, at a point, I had everybody looking like binded, like at a Kinko's or something like that, and I just told them like, you know, I get books early from other authors. You could see it before everybody else, and that gave me a lot of energy because I was working with high schoolers at the time, and I was really feeding off of what they were sharing with me in class, and I was also feeding off of what they were talking to me about after they would read like a scene and then tell me something similar happened to them. And in general, like I feel like as someone who writes for kids, I feel like your life needs to involve young people. It needs to involve youth, so that you can have a pulse on that. And so I think staying connected to young people helped me just kind of stay focused on what it is that I was doing here and why I was doing it.
Yeah.
So it didn't become just like transactional like any other job that I've had.
I think people who, like rappers, need to start becoming music teachers and sliding students their mixtapes. get a heads up of what they respond to. That's really smart, what you just
Very
said.
smart.
What about you, Ibi?
I read. I was a reader before I was a writer. So in entering the children's literature space, I read a lot of books, and it wasn't by marginalized authors because they weren't like widely available at that time. And then I have 3 children of my own. And more specifically with my recent book, Nigeria Jones, I noticed that there was no representation for Black hippies, for alternative Blackness on the page in terms of, the way my daughters are. If I showed you a picture of them, they look like, they came straight off of 1974, and all their friends look like, little hippies. And they're readers, and I wanted to have them on the page. And you're right, Candice, as just be around the children and see the variety that they come in. We have Black kids who are goth, who are, skateboarders, who are listening to trap or not listening to trap, who are, Taylor Swift fans and K-pop fans. And I'm seeing the range in how we exist, and I want to see that on the page. And I read what's out there. Although I was published before Candice, but reading everybody looking, I was like, I can go deeper. I can go deeper into like the soul of a child because you did it. Other writers are doing it. And I need to read the new stuff coming out to see what is resonating with young readers, what's not resonating, so those hidden gems. So I make sure that I'm exposed to the children, the people, the books, the art, the music, and consume it all. So whatever it is that I create is a reflection of what's already out there.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. So my first book was written for academic audience. I mean, it was to move forward a certain body of knowledge to contribute to a field, my first book. And all my books since then were purposely written with the belief that you're trained not to think this way, but was written to think that not all smart people are in the university, that there are smart people outside of the university who are interested in the research that I had done. And so I have always written very accessible books with deep scholarship, but written for audiences in the academy and outside of the academy. And those books have found they take time, but they find their way into the hands of the readers that they're written for. The last book that I wrote, Read Until You Understand, it found exactly the readers I knew were out there. And these were, I wrote that book for people who were incarcerated, who were readers, for kids, young people who were readers, I wrote that book for readers, and primarily for Black people who were readers, but not only Black people, but people who respected and valued Black life. And it found its way to those people and continues to find its way to them. And it has done so more quickly than my other books. My other books, it's taken years for people to find them, for those books to find their way to their readers. But it's like, it's a cliche, but I do believe that books find their way to the readers that they're meant to be. They're meant for.
Wondering if you can each share something I've been thinking, like just constantly thinking about the work I do, which is like playing that role of like advocating for other people's visions as an editor, and like being sometimes sitting in meetings where I have to remind myself that the person I'm trying to convince is actually not the person for whom the value of this project matters. Because sometimes it gets into a space where it's like I'm looking at a room and it's like, how do I talk about a short story collection about Black Muslims, not even to a bunch of white people? Like, that's sometimes the easiest thing, like, oh, they're white. It's like, no, like, it's like they're from like middle America. They are also like of a certain age group. And the difficulty is like learning to communicate a vision without compromising that vision. And like, because it's like, whether I like it or not, I have to galvanize y'all to do y'all job well. Because no one's gonna care. There's like, oh, your sales team looks like this. It's like, no, like, how do I sort of imbue or invest these people who are not necessarily equipped with the ability to take the work that we believe out into the world? I'm curious about like how you, what do you believe as artists it is your job, because there are some artists who don't believe this, to do the work of communicating the vision of your work to readers, or do you believe that that's the work of the reader?
Oh, that's not what I thought you were gonna ask at all.
No, well, so this is, I don't know where you thought I was going, but where did you think I was going?
I thought you were gonna say, is it the publisher's job to communicate that? Like, I thought you were asking about like, I thought it was a promo question.
No. So like, because
I think it's embedded in that though too.
But because the conversation is, as an editor, I can say it's their job to sell something, but I also know like they don't know how.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like I could leave this to somebody else, and I deal with this with artists all the time, is these sort of like existential, not like philosophical conversations, because some writers I'll tell like, you do, like, they think making something as accessible is akin to dumbing it down.
Yeah.
And there are artists I want to work with that are brilliant, but they are very stubborn about that. Like, they think those two things are the same thing. And then it's like they then get frustrated about the lack of opportunity that exists for them. And it's like, while there is this larger force in institutional things that keep a lot of Black brilliance out of the industry, when I encounter it one-on-one and I'm like, they think that being empathetic with the other person's experience is akin to them compromising the integrity of their art, are the same thing. That's when it gets difficult. And what I was explaining with the salesperson is like, I've encountered moments when I had to remind myself that what's important is that that person does their job, so that the person on the other end of this trigger knows that that book exists. So while I can get into this like holier than thou thing, it's like, well, you should know what this book is like they don't. And that's why I'm here, to make sure that they do know. And so I'm thinking about, as you as artists, do you feel like it is a part of your work, in addition to creating it, to have the kind of conversation that guides a reader through it if they don't get it? Because some writers and some artists are like, no, I did my work was just creating it. If you get it, you get it, and if you don't, you don't. And I just think, both as an editor, but also as a fan of things, there's always a missed opportunity when a person doesn't want to engage at that level. I have no like opinion if like someone decides not to, but I'm just like, I think that that's the difference between work like resonating in a way that sometimes it doesn't.
That's a great question. That's not me, right? Oh, okay.
No.
Oh, no, it's okay. I didn't know if that was the timer, like questions now.
Right.
So accessibility was something that I came into writing thinking a lot about, but I was really more so thinking about accessibility to Black kids. And
yes.
I think that us as artists, we should be open to engage about the work, but I also was trained to create with the kind of precision where your work speaks for itself. And if you have to keep explaining it, maybe you have not finished your work. And so,
okay.
I also,
got some snaps over there.
I also like choose to write the way that I do to make sure that my reader can receive it. So part of the reason I write in verse is, frankly, in the beginning I chose verse because it's less words, and that oftentimes is less intimidating to the kids who don't like to read.
Yeah.
They naturally will look into a verse novel and immediately think, oh, this is easy. And it's not necessarily easier, it's just less words. That is all that is happening that is different. And just also you're using poetic devices and all of that, but I do think about how the reader will receive it. I do prioritize certain readers over others.
Okay.
I do feel like I want Black kids to feel at home in my book to where they don't have to work super hard. And if you are any other race and there are things that don't just naturally hit, that's because it is not necessarily speaking directly to you, and I'm fine with you having to work harder for it. Like I'm fine with it not being clear immediately. And I do think that part of like putting a book out is engaging with the communities that you wrote it for as well, and engaging with whomever is going to read the work. I think accessibility doesn't mean dumbing it down. It is a skill to communicate or to create art in a way that people can touch it, but still be made well. I don't know. I don't know if I'm being clear.
No, I agree. Like I am somebody who, because of the position I play, represent this notion of like getting artists to like sell their souls by making things like, and I'm like, no, like wouldn't you? I just believe that it like brilliance deserves to have as many people that understand it as possible. And I think like that whole analogy, like if a tree fell and no one heard it, doesn't make a sound. It's like, yes, it makes a sound. No one heard it. And I think there's a lot of brilliant people who are making a lot of sounds that people just can't understand. And so for me, it's like as an editor of playing that role of like serving as an intermediary between, like there's a way in which as an editor, I advocate for readers because I'm thinking about the person who spent possibly their last $30 on a hardcover, $18, and they now are spending the next 4 hours with you. How do I make sure that that person's experience is not just like, you know, engaging, but worth the time and money they spent, but also on your job, on advocating for you to make sure that you are, for all the labor you're putting into the endeavor to create, that there is a readership who can come to you and go, yo, I really fuck with chapter 4, right? Like, and that moment happened because I realized that like the notion of like the meritocracy, like just good work making its way out into the world without any kind of like we take for granted that when we watch sports, there are literally people who make millions of dollars literally telling us what happened. Oh, he passed the ball to this person, then he dribbled, then he passed it behind his back. Like there are so many other industries that literally have critical discourse, breaking the thing down so that we understand it, and the arts doesn't necessarily have the same kind of discourse happening. And to what you said, Ibi, is like oftentimes the people commenting on the culture are not of it, they're not from it, So even though what they're talking about, they're not signaling to the audience that you're writing to, they're signaling to a different audience, which can throw your whole trajectory off as a creative. So that's why I'm saying, like, more or less, like what you're saying about accessibility, I know that as an editor, I believe that part of an artist's work is, in addition to the work on the page, it's about the work they do after. I know that some artists don't believe that, and I don't think that every artist should. I'm just like, I'm just curious about what y'all all believe as, like, what y'all find to be a part of y'all's work.
Again, I think that's a great question. I'm right here. I'm like several books in and still thinking about that. My last book is about a 16-year-old girl who grows up in a Pan-Africanist, militant, separatist Black family. I know I could say this here. Her father is like a Dr. Umar, and she's been homeschooled, raised vegan. And I felt the need in putting that book out, and I'm also commenting on Quakers in Philadelphia, and it's framed within the Constitution, and maternal health crisis, and just this idea of radicalization of Black people and radical ideas. So I felt the need, like, oh wow, I feel like I have to explain a whole bunch because it's so niche. But I know, growing up in New York City, I'm a Gen Xer, I know, I used to say the word hotep, I know communities, Afrocentric, Pan-Africanist communities, and this space was a hub at some point, and it still is, walking down 125th Street, those Black books. So I know the culture, and for me to write in the YA space from that culture, I'm like, how much do I explain? So my platform right now is Instagram. So I'm so glad that there have been other, other pieces, like there's a documentary on the East, Uhuru Sasa Wesi Shule, that was out in Bedford-Stuyvesant in the 70s, Afrocentric community. There's another sister who wrote about growing up as in the Shrine of the Black Madonna, which is another separatist movement out of, I think it was in Detroit. And all these other like Kemites and Orisha houses and all of that, I know that that is our tradition. But then it goes out into the world. How much do I explain? And I am pulling back because it can be exhausting. It's added work. It's extra work for me to go post something about Afrocentricity is still alive, or that sort of thing. And having those, I need to be able to work on the next book and not have to constantly have to explain the current project, because sometimes it feels like I'm either preaching to the choir or talking to brick walls. And I do want the work to fall on the reader, and for young people to fall on the educator. We have opportunities to write a little blog post, and there's the educator's guide. I love when they do educator's guide for a book, and I'm like, okay, I'm done. I did the work because I'm rest revolution. What is that, nap revolution? I'm napping after that work, nap ministry. So I feel you, like I'm starting to become, I'm gonna fall back and let the book do the work because it's done, right? And I did the work. Thank you for that though, because that's another perspective I need to consider.
I mean, you all have said it brilliantly. I don't have much to add. I make a living reading difficult books. That's what I do, and I, take great pleasure in reading difficult books, and learn a lot from reading them, and read with other people. I think there is something to be said about reading with other people difficult books. And Black people have a right to write difficult books. And to read them together, or with others, or with ourselves, or reread them. But I also think that I personally like to engage with readers. I mean, it's an honor to me when people read my book. It doesn't mean that I want to go out explaining everything, but it's an honor, and I like to meet with people who've read it and engage with readers and talk with them. That's not quite the same as talking to people who, trying to make accessible things that for audiences that I didn't necessarily,
Right.
you know, that I always have to explain every little thing. And I was just thinking about what you said. You know, there are books written all the time. There was a movie that just came out called Women Talking. Did anybody see that movie? It's a great movie. It's about a Mennonite community. You don't get any different, right?
Yeah.
The Mennonites, they the ones that make the furniture.
Yeah, well, I guess they do, but these,
No, I'm sorry, that's highly redundant. I'm sorry. Like, what-
but like nobody has to explain. I mean, Mennonites. Like, I mean, I guess somebody explains Mormons or Mennonites, but it was a great work of art, you know, and it raised universal questions, and you didn't have to understand every little thing about Mennonites in order to go watch that movie or read the book that it was. I bet you no one demanded that the woman who wrote that book explain everything about the Mennonite community in order to, you know, for people to appreciate what she did. I mean, I think the kinds of demands that we explain are often very, very racialized.
Yeah. Before I give it to, because I want to make, I don't think y'all responded to like what I'm saying. Like, I don't think it's anyone's labor to explain their work, right? Like, it's my job to tell you how to understand it. But I do think that something I've learned is that the average American is reading at a 6th grade reading level, right? And then I think about even the kinds of intellectual communities that have the space and time to do the work of reading a book over and over and over again. Like those kinds of interactions is why like the average person doesn't even recognize artistic work as work, because it's like, what does this amount to? Like, what does me reading Songs of Solomon 4 times really mean, unless it's assigned for class and it's a part of a grade. So when you take these books out of those spaces, like Ibi, I remember growing up in like Bed-Stuy, and it would be like the Nation of Islam, the 5 percenters, the Israelites, and then like these dudes, and they would just debate, and like that was what they did from sun up to sun. They would just argue and like share knowledge and do cipher stuff. But then it's like even that stopped. So like, you know, you go to the barbershop, you might get those kinds of conversations, but there's not often a lot of places where that kind of sustained discourse about art occurs. So it does, to me, I just understand that culture is so different than the way it was, that those discourses are not happening in the same way. And I don't think an artist should be the one leading it or the only ones having it, but it's just like,
The readers.
yeah, like just recognizing like because of those differences where we fall in. So we're gonna open the floor to some questions or comments. Raise your hand. Yes.
Oh, there's mics up back there.
There's mics
in the back.
Yeah, you go to the mic and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Hadassah. I have a question about the writing process. I did write something, it's called Black Girl Taking Up Space. And it's in manuscript form, and I'm just curious about how do you get to the eventual publishing process. I will say I have done something similar to what Candice mentioned by presenting this poem and the work to my students to get their feedback, so it was very effective. But I am curious about like the nuances of publishing work.
You're more efficient at explaining.
The writing process?
Like as in the publishing process or the writing process?
More so the publishing process. Like after you've finished writing, how do you go about figuring out how to get it published?
Well, you're in the right spaces to be around writers and be in the space. Quayle Festival, look up Quayle online if you haven't heard of them. They hold a literary festival, and they have, and I'm giving you practical, not anything, something you can do right now. They have literary agents looking at manuscripts, and that is specifically for writers of color. Being online now, and I was querying before social media, there are, I don't know if they're still doing that on Twitter, where you can share your pitches for novels. Yahdon is right here. He's an editor. I'm sorry. But it is knowing your work, having something finished and polished, something that you are proud of, and you start the querying process. It is it is a little bit of a gatekeeping, right? You have to get to somebody who will say yes to your work, and it only takes one person. It's finding out the literary agent process, knowing what querying is, knowing what a query letter is, even if it's not to an agent, it's to an editor. Learning as much as you can about the business of publishing and the businesses, having an agent, having an editor. There is marketing, there is publicity, knowing what it advances, it advances against royalties. There's so much. And it starts with just being in the room with other authors, and you start to get the information naturally. And for me, I was in the writer world. I used to come to the Schomburg and other literary events around the city way back in 1999. So my entire adult life, I've been in the literary world, and I was 19, 20, and I didn't get published until I was 39. And that was after attending a number of workshops. So workshops too, as well. Workshop, and it doesn't mean an MFA. I advise against paying for an MFA at this point because—
I concur.
You concur? Yeah. Thank you.
I have one and I concur.
I have one too and I concur. Workshopping, Quayle is an excellent resource. And just being around literary events like this one.
To give you even more tangible information, this is for anybody. I tell anybody this who asks me the same question. What you do is you go home, you look at 5 books that are like the book that you're writing. You look in the back, and the back has the acknowledgments page. The acknowledgments page lays out the agent who represents that work and the editor who acquired it. You make a list of those people, because what tends to happen, and that what writers talk about when they get rejected, is that they're not talking about who they're pitching to. A lot of times writers will go on Google, type in like top literary agents, and start submitting to just whoever's name comes up. And it's like you're submitting like a self-help book to somebody who represents fiction, but you don't know those distinctions because you're just thinking about being represented. So to your point, educating yourself, and this is another part of like the work of artists, like I genuinely believe, especially being on the other side, educating yourself about your business is your work. And there are so many artists who believe that the only work that they have to do is be creative, and it's like that is the highway to exploitation.
Yep.
There is no better way to take advantage of an artist than an artist who only cares about their art. So the thing I would tell you to do, in addition to what I just told you about the 5 things, is subscribe to Publishers Marketplace. Yeah. It's a $20 website a month, and it literally lists all the deals that happen every single day in publishing. And it has all the information of the agents, from emails to phone numbers, and you can begin to learn the business of it, because if you want to be in this business for a good time, be an artist. But if you want to be in this business for a long time, like you think about Toni Morrison doesn't get her first bestseller until 17 years into her career. Her first book was Blue Aside in 1970. Beloved is 1987. She doesn't get a Nobel until 22 years. Publishing is a long game. Yeah. And one of the things in terms of this whole discourse about how we think of failure, so many of us don't get to have long careers because we're thinking very short term. I just want an agent. I just want a book deal. So we're not thinking about who's representing us. We're not thinking about the deals we're signing. And then you sign for an amount of money you can't make back, and then you don't get a second book offer. You don't get a third. Or it takes you 10 years to like get to that place. So you're in the best position because right now you're new. I would tell you to do the education around the business of it, so that by the time you make your first pitch, or as you're pitching, you also are savvier about how to navigate the business side of it, which any good agent and any good editor is going to want to work with. So Publishers Marketplace, look in the 5 books, write those down, and then do your research about those agents and editors, because they'll show you what they've acquired in the last year. And then you can pitch them directly. Yes.
Damn, this mic is crazy. What's going on? We've been talking a lot about work and labor, and so I'm curious about what your relationship is to leisure and how that factors into each of your writing practices and also your lives in general.
Excellent.
Leisure.
I love that question.
Yes, thank you.
That was great. It's like a vacation right now. I am a writer who takes a lot of breaks, like a lot. I am not a person who like will sit and write for 5 to 7 hours a day. My mentor is that way. I'm more so like 45 minutes and then get up and take a break for an hour. Maybe then I'll sit down for 3 hours and then I'll maybe go take a walk. And leisure is just really like taking breaths throughout the day, which some people might consider leisure. I consider really important for my process. I need like time not looking at the actual words and not looking at the actual paper and not even thinking about the story itself. And I spend a lot of time in nature. That's actually where I'm able to really parse out the issues with my work, because when I'm in nature, I get connected again to life, and I get connected to why I wrote the story. And so I take a lot of breaks. I take a lot of walks. Walking is like a meditation for my writing practice. And my agent is pushing me to take more vacations because I really have like a lot of breakdowns. I haven't really learned. I'm in the process of learning the pacing of putting in all of this work and then also giving my brain a break because I know a lot of writers who they crash and then suddenly we're just not writing anything at all because we've just been going too hard. So I prioritize breaks. I also am not a writer who writes every single day. That exhausts me. And then I also prefer to write at night, which gives me a lot of like room so that I don't wake up in the morning and immediately think I have to go sit at my desk. I don't know if that is a good answer for what you're asking, but my leisure is built into my life.
I don't rest. Sounds nice, must be nice, right? Let's see, my 9th book just came out last month, and my first book came out February 2017. So that's 9 books in 5, 6 years.
Wild.
And I already have a few more books under contract. So I don't know how to rest my creative brain. And that's what Octavia Butler called a furor scribendi, a rage for writing. And I think it's become habit now because I've been doing it for so long. It's no longer inspiration. It doesn't even feel like work. It's habit. I wake up and think about my current project. It's obsessive. I think about words. I think about the characters and story all day. I think maybe there's something wrong. I don't know. But it does affect my daily life where it's hard to connect. It's work to have small talk because I'm always thinking intellectually and creatively. I'm also a mom of 3. I'm CEO of my household. I do get a lot of support from my partner, and that's about it. What makes it more exhausting for me is promoting and being on social media. So that sort of your last question, if I can just work creatively, put out a book, move on to the next thing, is my greatest joy. I don't need break from the creative stuff because the creative stuff is my leisure, if you understand. Authoring is work, writing is my leisure because everything else seems like work outside of that.
Yeah. It's funny. Toni Morrison used to say that about writing for her, like that's what writing was. She's like, I don't do vacations because I write. Yeah. Hi, Tyler. How are you?
That's Tyler?
Yes. Tyler is a...
I know Tyler.
Yeah, do you know Tyler? Well, Tyler, it's just good to see you. Anyway, as you know, I don't have enough leisure, but I would like more. What little I do have is in nature, is my leisure, walking, but definitely need much more. And I also, I think live, like being in New York, as much, engaging as much art as I can. Yeah. Live performances and visual art, I mean, taking advantage of the arts is leisure to me, but also it's also feeding whatever creative thing I'm going to be doing. Yeah. So,
to answer that in the transition, I am in agreement with. I don't think of my work as work because my work was not something I grew up having access to. So like I had jobs from everywhere, from being packing bags at supermarkets. I was security at a 99-cent store, which is like wild when you look at my frame. I worked at Dave & Buster's. I had all these like jobs, and I remember like just wanting to be in a space where I got to think creatively and create culture. And I know that there's this whole notion of like retiring, and people ask me like, oh, you're gonna retire? And it's like, I have the kind of thing that like I do until it's a part of my life and not separate from it. So like, I think leisure would have functioned more if I was like still working at the supermarket and I had to like stock the shelves. But like when I think about like what I get to do, like this is not something I have to do. Like I want to like have these conversations. I want to champion books. So leisure in that context, I think of what I do as leisure as well, because this is something that like not many of the people I grew up around get to make art for a living and get a salary and get those things. So I think about that. You want to take the last one, and then last question.
Hi, I'm Andrea, and I'm in the process of writing a book. This is going to be my very first book. It's a fictional, and I want to do self-publishing. However, I got some of the information that you gave to the other party that was sitting here, but I wanted to ask the question as to when you get an editor, how do you feel safe with that editor being a self-publisher? You know, you want to be safe to get the right person to edit your book and not steal the content of it. And also, I wanted to find out how do you actually get the book binded, covered, illustrations, and all that other stuff.
So you want to know how to make a book, huh?
Yes, I'm pretty much self-publishing, so I just know how to do it.
So are you asking like how to find an editor? Or like how to find a trusted editor?
Well, I guess the basic process.
It depends.
Well, self-publishing is its own endeavor. It works very differently. Like, you know, when you self-publish, here's something I'll tell you about self-publishing that a lot of people who self-publish take for granted. When you self-publish, you become a publisher. You're no longer just a writer. So you're your own marketing team, you're your own publicity team, you're your own design team. Like you talk about labor, right? Like if you had a quote unquote traditional deal, and all a traditional deal is what you're responsible for. When you become a self-publisher, the way you have to now think about the book is like all the different ways that just being a writer does not allow you to, because you're essentially functioning as the person who's thinking about the financial success in addition to the creative thing, which means that like when it comes to like an editor for you, is like you would have to effectively, what is it called? Like do a headhunter, like search for editors and then interview them, because you would have to hire someone to edit your book. So the best way to do, like in terms of like even like the best way to do that is like you can Google freelance editors and look at people who have like, backgrounds working for publishers, and like just interview them about your book. And this is something that I would say to any creative, a lot of creatives don't, or a lot of writers don't know, is that like you don't work for your agent works for you. Exactly. And I say that because there's a lot of times where writers talk about their agents as though they're employed by their agents. They're afraid to ask questions. They're afraid to say no. Which means they misconstrue the whole power dynamic. And it's important for all of you to feel empowered to ask questions. So if you don't feel comfortable asking questions to someone who works for you, that is a part of the work of a creative as well. Like you have to be comfortable with knowing that these people that work with you, and particularly your agent who works for you, they have a responsibility to answer your questions. So the answer to your question about editors is that like the way you make sure that you are finding the right partners, you make sure you have the right questions that help you gauge if the editor is the right partner for you. Because without you asking your own questions, you have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
But one thing, you just don't accept whatever someone tells you. Like, if you have the inkling of a curiosity, pursue it.
I'll also add this Saturday at the Schomburg Center's Literary Festival, the 5th annual, there are self-published writers who will have their own tents on 135th Street. So ask other self-published writers, you know, who may be finding some success being a self-published author about sort of what their process was. But I would ask, you know, I think I was just asking Farah last week about how does one choose an editor? Like, how do you know that this person is right for you? And so while it may be a different situation, I would love to hear sort of just how you all work with your editors, with your work.
I've had different editors. I mean, I've had different relationships with different editors, and some of them have been very problematic, and some of them have been wonderful. And the best ones, the most generative ones, have been, you know, editors who I trust them as readers of my work. I trust them as not being very invasive, but asking me the right kinds of questions that are going to make me go back. I feel like with the best editor, I am a better writer. I am a better writer because they've asked me the right questions, or they've opened up a set of ideas, you know, helped me open up a set of ideas. They help me think about the things that I know I need to think about. They haven't imposed something there. And so that, for me, that works. But I think it really depends on each individual writer. I'm sure we would all have something very different to say about what we need from an editor.
I chose my editor. I've been with the same editor for my first 3 books, and I chose him because he loves the way that he talked about poems. My first book, Everybody Looking, is a verse novel, and he just seemed really passionate. He knew about all the writers that I loved. He had a vision for my work after he read it. Like, he actually could tell me where he wanted to place it, who might be interesting for me to be in conversation with. He could see it as a whole project. He also could see me, he had a vision for my career as well. And so it wasn't just somebody who was like eager to work with me, but he was inspired to really think about what would benefit me as someone who wants to have a long career. And also, to piggyback off what you just said, my editor asks great questions, and that makes it easier for me to edit well. Like, I am a person who sucks at the drafting part, and then the revisions is where everything sings. And that's because my editor knows what questions to ask me to bring out what needs to come out.
We have the same editor. 2 of my books are with Candice's editor. So I hear you. I have another editor, HarperCollins, 2 very different personalities, but I just realized they're both Libras, so that's a good thing. Very interesting. So, one of my editors, I was having a hard time publishing. We talked about the business of publishing, but there's also the social dynamic of publishing, which is very, very hard. If you're coming from a very Black cultural space, publishing is very white. And there's all these layers that you're entering a different space. And I remember bawling in front of my editor, explaining this to her, that the social dynamics was very hard. I've had some experiences where it was hard for me to navigate. And that was a few years ago. And I need to be emotional with, when they're white. There's a white man, our editor, and then a white woman. And they may not know everything about where we come from or who they are, but I need them to see me as human and not a little cash cow or anything like that. It's so important that even if they don't understand what I'm trying to say, that we can have a conversation. I need, I can access them via text. They know my family. So for me, it's not a work relationship. I will be very sad if it's boss, employee. This is a creative partner. And that creative partner needs to know, like, I'm a mom, I can't get this to you. You know, I know way past the deadline, but I got to deal with this school thing. So to me, the personal relationship is very important. Doesn't have to be there in the beginning, but grow to understand me as an artist, as a human, as a parent, all these layers of myself where I can feel very human in a very white commercial space that is a business.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. I hope that was helpful. You know, what I'm also hearing is that these are writers who trust their writing, right? So once you hit the revision or the editing process, you're open to someone being in there because you already trust yourself as a writer. So it's not about like, is my writing good or bad in that kind of sense, but rather, have I arrived yet, right? Or have I worked through the questions that I think I'm trying to answer? The last question will be from me as we wrap up. So I am curious because I am interested in these linkages. So if you could have a dinner, a little light, small table, maybe at a Cafe Carlyle or what used to be the Linux Lounge, you can invite 2 authors who are no longer with us to have a drink or an appetizer and ask them 2 questions about their writing practice. Who would they be? I'll start with you, Yahdon.
Oh, okay. I thought I was the moderator. Okay. One is easy is Baldwin, and the other person would be Zora Neale Hurston, because something I learned about her, like the woman, and this was in Alice Walker's essay about her. She took a job selling hot dogs so she can eavesdrop on black people's conversations to write a book. You know how committed? That's like some method acting shit. Like, you gonna sell hot dogs to learn how black people talk? Like, that's wild. Like, that level of depth. I would probably talk to her more than Baldwin. Baldwin gonna talk though, but I would talk to her. That's my answer.
Okay. Now, Farah, it can't be anybody that you already know. Because you know some people. You've been
They gotta
around.
be dead,
You've known some folks. You've written the letters.
Yeah, that's such a hard question. One, Toni, who I knew and loved, but just because I sort of took for granted that she would always be here, and now there are all these questions that I'm like, I can't believe I didn't ask her that, or, you know, did she know this person? Or so she would be one of them, and just for the chance to be with her again. And then I don't know who the second one would be. It would be somebody like, I don't know. That would be. There's so many of them. But she said writer, so
She did write her song?
yeah, she did. I think I would be afraid to be with Billie Holiday. So I would. I think I'd just listen to her music. So it would probably be some 19th century person, you know, like Frederick Douglass or something. Oh. Yeah. And I would probably ask him. I would really ask him how he. He wrote so much about how he learned to read. We all know how he learned to read. I would ask him how he learned to write. You know, did he learn to write? Because he's this remarkable writer. Yeah. So I would ask him how he learned to put those sentences together. Was it from reading? You know, because he didn't take a class on writing. You know, so I think that's probably what I would ask him. How did he become such a great writer? Yeah.
I would definitely want to sit with Zora Neale Hurston as well, but in Haiti. Okay. She's been to Haiti. I'm Haitian born. I've met Octavia Butler. I've had dinner, lunch, and breakfast with Octavia Butler because I studied with her at a workshop. I've had email exchanges with Octavia Butler, but that was over 20 years ago. And I was slightly disappointed when I first met her. Really quickly, I was coming out of Hunter College in the Black and Puerto Rican Studies department, and I had like really radical professors who are very African-centered, nationalist professors, and reading Wild Seed, I thought that I was getting somewhat of a militant writer in Octavia Butler. When I first met her, she is not that. She was more. And when I realized that she was more than that, it was too late. I exchanged with her, but I was she was surrounded by white science fiction writers in Seattle. Science fiction is very, very white male-centered. And she was in this bubble, and she was revered. However, she was this tall black woman in a sea of white, and she always said that there were 3 black science fiction writers. It was her, Stephen Barnes, and Samuel Delaney for a very long time, even when she met us young writers. So in hindsight, I would want to sit with her now and say, you know what you wrote in the Parable of Sower came true, and just to see like, okay, what's next, Butler? She wasn't a sage, but she was just an observer. And I wish I could, just sit with her again as an older writer.
I'm gonna call dibs on your archive of the future, because those letters must be incredible.
Oh, her?
Yours, just yours in general. It sounds like
mine?
your correspondence with folks.
Oh yeah, I lost them because they were on AOL. No. We exchanged email.
The servers is gone.
Sorry, I didn't know this was about to turn dramatic.
I think that I would want to sit down with Audre Lorde, just because I feel like her life is really exciting and super queer. And I think I'd also would want to I don't know if I would want to talk to her, but I think I would want to listen to her talk. June Jordan, just because I feel like I just found her to be profoundly, I don't know, she has a whole poem with just the word no over and over again in different ways. I feel like I would just want to watch her interact with other people and see how she is just as a person, if she was as assertive as her work seemed.
Well, thank you. I just have to say.
Hold on, 1 second. I'm gonna take my job back. What's your 2 people?
Yeah.
I didn't come out here for that. Who are my 2 people? One person would be Margaret Walker.
Okay.
She's someone who I only recently found out or learned more about when I was visiting Jackson. And there's a whole center there at that university. And so there's going to be a new biography about her coming out later this fall, I want to say. Okay. So I'll get a chance to read a little bit more about her life, but she seemed to be like other writers' writer. So I want to learn more about her. And the second person would be, I think, this is the answer on today. Today, the other person would be Audre Lorde as well. Her interview in this book is just incredible. I feel like you really do understand, she has such clarity about her writing, about her sense of personhood, and about the power of writing, right? Writing, not keeping silent, all of that. And in this one interview, it's kind of like she has summarized all of her writing across the board. Once you start to read her widely, this one interview kind of places all of that in context. And so I would love to meet her and to just understand, what it was like for her to really kind of always be out and clear, at a period of time. So those would be my 2 people on today.
All right.
With that said, thank you all so much for joining us. This book is available in the bookshop, as well as some of our authors' books as well. I hope that you plan to join us, if not on Wednesday for our Henry Threadgill, that you will join us for our literary block party, also known as the Schomburg Center's Literary Festival. You have a really great night, and I hope you all talk amongst yourselves, because I can say that there are publishers and editors in this room, but I don't want to call them out in case that's not what they're here to do today. Have a good night.
Everybody looking around who are you? Stand up.
That's why you gotta chat. You gotta.
Thank you. So dope.